The sky above Montana burned with colors that had never been seen on Earth before Sabiel rose higher and higher. Her body wreathed in flames that seemed to bend the light around them, and the consortium forces below stared upward in frozen terror at the creature they had thought was weak and dying. Jong-ho felt her presence in his mind like a second heartbeat, their bond humming with power that neither of them fully understood. This was what the Dracori were meant to be. Not slaves chained to ships, but guardians who chose their companions freely. The ancient empire had stolen this from them, twisted the bond into a tool of control. But Sabiel was remembering now what her kind had been before the chains. Thank you, Jong-ho, her voice echoed in his thoughts. Warm and fierce and grateful, for reminding me that I am more than what they made me. The first consortium ship tried to flee, its engines screaming as it clawed for orbit. But Sabiel was faster. She breathed fire that burned through shields and armor like paper, and the ship tumbled from the sky trailing smoke and debris. The second ship opened fire, and Sabiel twisted through the barrage with grace that seemed impossible for a creature her size. She struck the ship's engine section with her tail, and the vessel spun wildly before crashing into an empty field miles from the homestead. Fleet Commander Kethrix's flagship hung in low orbit, close enough to strike but far enough to escape if necessary. Through the bond, Jong-ho felt Sabiai's exhaustion, the toll that this display of power was taking on her still-healing body. She could not sustain this much longer, but she did not need to. Lights appeared in the sky that were different from the consortium ships. Silver vessels marked with symbols that Sabiel recognized instantly, the Galactic Arbiter Council, an arrived consortium fleet. You are in violation of 17 galactic statutes. A voice broadcast across all frequencies. You are ordered to stand down immediately and submit to judgment. The consortium commander's response was predictable but stupid. Instead of surrendering, Kethrix ordered his remaining forces to attack the Arbiter ships while simultaneously trying to flee toward the outer system. The Arbiters had anticipated this in the space of 30 seconds. Every consortium vessel was disabled by weapons that seemed to simply turn off their engines and weapons. Systems Kethrix's flagship hung dead in space, and the creatures aboard were transported directly to an Arbiter holding cell. It was over. Sabiel descended slowly, the flames around her dying down as she landed in the field before the farmhouse. Jong-ho ran to her as quickly as his old legs could carry him, and he was the first to reach her when she collapsed from exhaustion. You did it, he whispered, placing his hand on her great snout. You saved us all. We did it. She corrected him weakly. I could never have found that strength without you. Without all of you. The Arbiter Council sent representatives to the surface the following day, and what followed was 3 weeks of negotiations that would change Earth's place in the galaxy forever. The consortium was dissolved, its assets seized and distributed to its victims, and the remaining Dracori were offered protection by the Council itself. More importantly, Earth was recognized as a protected world with the potential for full galactic membership once its people were ready. Jong-ho was offered rewards beyond imagination, technology and wealth, and a position of honor on any world he chose. He turned it all down. I have everything I need right here, he told the Arbiter representative, gesturing at his farmhouse and his land, and the dragon who had made a nest in his expanded barn. Besides, I am too old to go gallivanting across the stars. The representative, a being that looked something like a tall blue humanoid with too many eyes, studied him with obvious confusion. You could live for centuries with our medical technology, travel to worlds beyond your imagination, and you choose to stay here. This is my home, Jong-ho said simply. My wife is buried on that hill over there, and my family lives within a day's drive. I have a garden that needs tending, and a dragon who still has not learned how to play poker properly. Sabiel snorted from her nest. sending a puff of warm air across the yard. "I am learning. Your game makes no sense and relies entirely on deception." That is exactly the point. Spring came to Montana 3 months later, and the homestead had settled into a new kind of normal. Sybiel's nest had become a permanent structure. Half barn and half palace, decorated with gifts from grateful Drecory across the galaxy. Jongho's family visited constantly, his great-grandchildren utterly fearless around a dragon who let them climb on her back and slide down her tail. Yuna had been recruited by a new Earth Galactic Liaison Office, and she spent her days preparing humanity for its eventual introduction to the wider universe. She visited every weekend, always bringing stories of the strange and wonderful things happening as Earth began to find its place among the stars. On a warm afternoon in late April, Jongho walked slowly up the hill, behind his house, to the small grave where his wife rested. He sat down on the bench he had built years ago and looked out over the land they had shared. "You would not believe what has happened, Suni," he said quietly. "I found a dragon in our ravine, and now the whole galaxy knows about us. And your great-grandchildren are learning to speak alien languages, and I think you would have liked Sabiel." He sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Below, he could see Sabiel playing with the children, her massive form moving with surprising gentleness as she let them pretend to ride her into battle against imaginary enemies. "She asked me once why humans help strangers," Jongho continued. "I told her it was just what we do. But I think the real answer is that we are all strangers until someone decides we are not." He reached out and touched the headstone gently. "Thank you for teaching me that, my love. Thank you for showing me that family is something you choose." A warm presence touched his mind, and Jongho looked up to see Sabiel climbing the hill toward him. She settled beside the grave with a grace that belied her size and lowered her head in a gesture of respect. "She sounds like she was remarkable," the dragon said softly. "She was. I wish I could have met her." Jongho smiled and placed his hand on Sabiel's snout. "She would have loved you. And she definitely would have tried to feed you because she believed all problems could be solved with good food. She sounds wise." They sat together as the sun set, an old man and an ancient dragon, watching the stars come out one by one. Somewhere up there, the galaxy was changing because of what had happened on this small farm in Montana. Somewhere up there, humanity was taking its first steps toward a future no one had imagined possible. But down here, in this moment, all that mattered was family. "Jongho," Sabiel said eventually, "I have decided something." "What is that?" "This is my home now. Not just because I have nowhere else to go, but because I choose it. Because you chose me when you had no reason to. And because I have never felt safer than I do right here." Jongho patted her snout and smiled the same smile his wife had fallen in love with 50 years ago. "Welcome to the family, Sabiel." Below them, the children's laughter echoed across the homestead as the first stars of evening began to shine. The universe had gotten a little smaller, a little kinder, and a little more like home. The hours ticked away like water draining from a sink, and the homestead became a fortress. Trenches were dug and reinforced with whatever materials could be found. Weapons were distributed, and positions were assigned. Jongho moved among his people with a calm he did not entirely feel, offering encouragement and checking preparations and making sure everyone knew their role word had spread beyond his original calls. And more volunteers had arrived throughout the night. Some were veterans who had heard about the situation through back channels. Others were locals who simply refused to let their neighbor face an alien invasion alone. By dawn, nearly 80 people stood ready to defend a single dragon against the might of an interstellar corporation. It was madness, and Jongho had never been prouder of his species in the barn. Yuna worked alongside Sebiel to repair the emergency beacon. The Dragon's crashed ship had been badly damaged, but the beacon was a self-contained unit designed to survive almost anything. The problem was that it required a specific activation sequence that Sebiel could perform telepathically, but humans could not. There has to be a way, Yuna insisted, her fingers flying over a keyboard connected to the alien technology. If you can do it mentally, there must be a physical equivalent. The beacon responds to Dracori neural patterns, Sabiel explained. It was designed this way to prevent enemies from using it against us, and no other species has ever been able to activate one. Then we need to find another way to connect you to it. Jong-ho entered the barn carrying coffee, and the stubborn expression his family knew well. What if we did not need to replicate your neural patterns exactly? He said. What if we just needed to amplify them? Sabiel tilted her head. I do not understand. Your telepathy reaches my mind. Jong-ho continued. I feel it when you speak to me, like a warmth behind my eyes. So what if we use that connection to boost your signal through the beacon? That has never been done. Has anyone ever tried? The dragon considered this for a long moment. No one has ever cared enough to try. Then let us be the first. They spent the next 3 hours rigging a connection between CBL's neural interface and Jong-ho's engineering equipment. It was jury-rigged, and probably dangerous and violated every principle of both human and alien technology. But when they finally activated the system, the beacon hummed to life with a sound like distant bells. It is working, Sabiel breathed, wonder filling her telepathic voice. The signal is reaching the Arbiter Council. Will they come? They must observe before they can act. But yes, they will come. The moment of celebration was shattered by an explosion that rocked the barn to its foundations through the open door. Jong-ho could see lights descending from the sky, too many to count, and his heart sank as he realized the consortium had moved up their timetable. They know about the beacon, Yuna said grimly. They are trying to destroy it before the Arbiters arrive. Jong-ho grabbed his rifle and headed for the door. Then we hold them off until our witnesses get here. Simple as that. Grandfather, that is insane. Yuna, I have been doing insane things since before your mother was born, and I am too old to stop now. The battle that followed would become legend in 2 galaxies. The consortium forces expected to overwhelm a primitive species within minutes. Instead, they found themselves fighting through terrain that had been prepared by people who had spent lifetimes learning how to defend their homes. Every advance caused them soldiers. Every meter of ground came at a price. Jong-ho fought alongside his neighbors and his family, using every trick he had learned in 72 years of life. He was not fast, and he was not strong, but he knew this land like he knew his own heartbeat, and he refused to give an inch of it without a fight. The defenders fell back slowly, trading space for time. 3 of them were seriously wounded in the first hour, and Jong-ho sent them to the barn where Sabiel could protect them with her shields. More injuries followed as the consortium forces pushed closer, using their superior firepower to wear down the human defenses. By the 6th hour, the defenders had been pushed back to the farmhouse itself. Jong-ho crouched behind an overturned tractor, breathing hard, his rifle nearly out of ammunition around him. His people were battered and exhausted, but still fighting the consortium. Commander's voice boomed across the battlefield. Through some kind of amplification system, surrender now and your deaths will be quick. Continue to resist and we will make you suffer. Jong-ho looked at the faces of the people who had come to help him. He saw his daughter clutching a hunting rifle she had never fired in anger. He saw his granddaughter coordinating their remaining defenses with blood running down her face from a wound on her scalp. He saw old friends and new allies, all of them ready to die for a cause they had only learned about weeks ago. He stood up slowly, his old knees protesting, and raised his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have a message for Fleet Commander Kethrix," he shouted. "When my wife was alive, she had a saying for people who tried to push her around, and Sabiel. I need you to translate this into whatever language these bugs speak." The dragon's telepathic presence touched his mind. Ready to transmit his words, Jong-ho smiled grimly. She would say, "You think you have cornered a frightened animal, but what you have actually done is given a stubborn old creature no reason left to hold back. So come and learn why my family has survived for 1,000 generations." Sabiel broadcast the message. And for a moment, the battlefield fell silent. Then the consortium commander laughed. A horrible clicking sound that echoed through the night. "So be it. Begin the final assault." The aliens surged forward, and the defenders prepared to make their last stand. But in the barn behind them, something was happening. The emergency beacon had done more than just send a message to the Arbiter Council. It had also reminded Sabriel of who she truly was. For 10,000 years, she had been a slave and a fugitive, always running and always afraid. But here on this strange world, surrounded by beings who fought impossible odds simply because they refused to surrender, she found something she had lost so long ago she had forgotten it existed. She found her fire. The barn doors exploded outward, and Sabiel emerged wreathed in flames that burned blue and white like the heart of a star. Her wounds had not healed, and she was far from full strength, but she was a Dracori, one of the great dragons of the galaxy, and she would not let these people die for her without giving everything she had left. "Jong-ho," her voice rang in his mind like thunder. "I need your help one more time." He understood without asking the bond they had built over weeks of care and conversation was more than just friendship. It was the connection that the Dracori had always been meant to have. Not with masters who enslaved them, but with companions who loved them. He opened his mind to her completely, and Sabiel drew upon that bond like a drowning creature gasping for air. Light exploded across the battlefield, and the consortium forces froze in terror as the dragon they had come to capture rose into the sky on wings of pure energy. 3 weeks after the crash, the homestead had transformed into something between a military camp and a family reunion. Jong-ho's phone calls had spread through networks he had spent a lifetime building, and the response had exceeded his wildest expectations. His old engineering partner, Wang Daeho, had arrived first. A man of 70, who still had clearances that make government agents nervous. Then came a steady stream of veterans, engineers, hunters, and stubborn country folk who heard that something strange was happening at the Park homestead and decided they wanted to be part of it. Jong-ho's daughter Minji had called him crazy and then driven up from Denver with her husband and enough supplies to last a month. His granddaughter Yuna, who served as a communications specialist in the army, had taken emergency leave the moment she heard what was happening. She arrived in uniform and immediately began setting up equipment that Jong-ho pretended not to recognize. Sabiel watched all of this with growing amazement. She had recovered enough to move around the property, though she still could not fly or use her more powerful abilities in the evenings, when the humans gathered around fires to share stories and plan defenses. She would curl up nearby and listen to them with wonder in her ancient eyes. "I do not understand your kind," she told Jong-ho one night as they stood together watching the stars. "I have witnessed 1,000 species across 1,000 worlds, and none of them behave like humans." "How do you mean?" Sabiel's tail curled around her body as she considered her words. "Most species are logical. They calculate risks and rewards and act accordingly. But your people came here to defend a creature they had never met simply because you asked them to. That is what family does." Jong-ho replied, "They are not your blood family, no. But they are family nonetheless. And family shows up when you need them. The dragon was silent for a long moment. I have never had a family. Jong-ho, the Dracori were scattered when I was young, and I have spent most of my life alone or in chains. Jong-ho reached up and placed his weathered hand on her massive shoulder. You have one now. The peace of that moment shattered the following morning when Yuna's equipment detected an energy signature entering Earth's atmosphere. It was not a satellite or a meteor or any known human craft. It was a Vethrak scout ship, and it was heading directly for Montana. Jong-ho gathered everyone in the barn for what might be their final planning session. Nearly 40 people had answered his call, ranging from his 80-year-old neighbor who had served in Korea to Yuna's army friends who had driven through the night to reach them. The consortium is here, he announced without preamble. One ship for now. Probably scouts to assess the situation before they call in the rest of their fleet. And we have maybe 6 hours before they arrive. What are we dealing with? Daeho asked. Sabiel projected images into their minds, sharing her memories of Vethrak soldiers and their weapons and their ships. The humans absorbed this information with grim determination rather than fear, and several began taking notes. Their weapons are more advanced than ours, Yuna observed. But they are designed for space combat, not ground warfare. And our terrain will give us advantages they will not expect. They will also underestimate us. Jong-ho added, the consortium views non-spacefaring species as primitives, barely worth consideration. Good, growled his neighbor, checking the rifle he had carried since the 1950s. Let them underestimate us. The plan came together quickly. Born from decades of combined military and engineering experience, they would not try to match the aliens in firepower because that was a battle they could not win. Instead, they would use the terrain and their knowledge of the land and their willingness to fight dirty. Sabiel offered what help she could, teaching Yuna how to disrupt Vethrak communications and showing Daeho the weak points in their armor. The scout ship landed at dusk in a clearing 3 kilometers from the homestead. Jong-ho watched through binoculars as 5 figures emerged, tall and insectoid with too many limbs, and armor that gleamed like oil on water. They moved with the confidence of predators who had never encountered prey that fought back. They did not make it 1 kilometer before the first trap was sprung. The Vethrak Point Scout stepped on a pressure plate that Jong-ho had rigged that afternoon, and the resulting explosion sent the creature flying into a tree with enough force to crack its armor. The other 4 immediately took defensive positions, but they were looking up for aerial attacks rather than down where Yuna's team had buried more surprises. By the time they reached the edge of Jong-ho's property, only 2 scouts remained. One of them finally got a clear shot at the farmhouse, but the energy bolt was absorbed by a shield that Sabiel had managed to create using parts from her crashed ship. The other scout tried to call for reinforcements, but Yuna's jamming equipment turned its transmission into static. The final battle was brief and brutal. The scouts had been trained to capture and subdue, not to fight against enemies who refused to surrender when it was over. Jong-ho's people had suffered 3 injuries, none of them serious, and the Vethrak consortium had lost its entire advance team, but the victory was temporary, and everyone knew it. Yuna intercepted a transmission before the jamming went up, a message from the scout ship to a much larger vessel waiting beyond the moon. The consortium commander now knew that Earth was not the easy target they had expected. The response was immediate and terrifying. A holographic image appeared above the crashed scout ship, projected from orbit, showing a creature that resembled a praying mantis crossed with a nightmare. It identified itself as Fleet Commander Kethrix, and its message was simple: surrender the Dracori within 12 standard hours, or we will sterilize the area from orbit, and your primitive defenses cannot stop us. The image faded, and Jong-ho looked around at the people who had come to help him. He saw fear in their eyes, but also something else. Something that made him proud to be human. "Well," said his old neighbor, reloading his rifle with steady hands, "I guess we have 12 hours to figure out how to stop a fleet." "We cannot stop them," Sabiel said quietly, "but perhaps we do not need to stop them. Perhaps we only need witnesses." She turned to Yuna with new intensity in her golden eyes. "My ship's emergency beacon still functions. And if we can get it working, we can call the Galactic Arbiter Council. And they will not be able to ignore what the consortium is doing here. Will that work?" Jong-ho asked. "It might be our only chance." Jong-ho nodded once and turned to his granddaughter. "Yuna, go with Sabiel and learn whatever she needs to teach you. And everyone else, we are not surrendering and we are not running. So let us make these next 12 hours count." The humans scattered to their tasks with renewed purpose. And Sabiel watched them go with something approaching awe in 10,000 years. She had never seen anything like this, a species that refused to give up even when the odds were impossible. Perhaps that was why she had crashed on this particular world. Perhaps the universe had a sense of humor after all. Park Jong-ho woke before dawn as he always did, his old bones creaking as he swung his legs off the bed and reached for the worn slippers his wife had given him 15 years ago. The Montana winter had arrived early this year, and frost covered every window of the old farmhouse like delicate lace made of ice. He made his coffee the same way he had for 50 years, strong and black, and carried it to his small workshop where his amateur seismograph equipment hummed quietly in the corner. At 72 years old, Jong-ho had earned his quiet life. He had spent 40 years as an aerospace engineer, working on projects he still could not discuss. And when his wife Suni passed 3 years ago, he had retreated to her family homestead to live out his remaining days in peace. The equipment beeped twice, and Jong-ho frowned at the readings on his screen. Something had struck the Earth, approximately 4 kilometers northeast of his property, and the impact signature was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was too controlled for a meteor, too heavy for an aircraft, and the seismic waves suggested something had burrowed into the ground upon impact rather than simply crashing. Jong-ho finished his coffee and considered his options. He could call the authorities and let them handle whatever had fallen from the sky. Or he could bundle up in his warmest coat and go investigate himself. His daughter would scold him for being reckless. His granddaughter Yuna would call him stubborn. His wife, if she were still alive, would simply hand him his hat and tell him to be home for dinner. He chose the second option. The hike through the snow-covered forest took nearly 2 hours, and by the time Jong-ho reached the ravine where his instruments had pinpointed the impact, his legs ached and his breath came in visible puffs of white. But what he found made every step worth the effort. A trench had been carved through the frozen earth, stretching nearly 100 meters from the ridge above to the bottom of the ravine. At the end of this trench sat a structure that defied explanation. It was crystalline, almost like quartz, but shot through with veins of deep purple and shimmering gold. The surface was covered in frost, but beneath the ice Jong-ho could see strange symbols etched into the material, a language that was clearly not of human origin. He stood there for a long moment, his engineering mind cataloging every detail, while his heart raced with a mixture of fear and wonder. In all his years working on classified aerospace projects, he had never seen anything like this. He had always suspected humanity was not alone in the universe. But suspecting and knowing were very different things. Jong-ho approached the structure carefully, his boots crunching through the fresh snow as he drew closer. He realized the crystalline material was translucent, and something massive was visible inside. His breath caught in his throat. The creature was serpentine, at least 8 meters long, with scales that shimmered with bioluminescent patterns of blue and green, even in its dormant state. great wings were folded against its body, and its head was crowned with horns that swept back like the branches of an ancient tree. It looked like a dragon from the old stories his grandmother used to tell, the ones about celestial creatures that guarded the heavens. But this was no myth. This was real. And it was frozen inside what Jong-ho now understood was some kind of stasis pod. He reached out with one gloved hand and touched the surface of the pod. The crystal was warm despite the freezing temperature, and the symbols beneath his fingers seemed to pulse with faint light at his touch. Then the creature's eyes opened. They were vast and golden, filled with an intelligence that was clearly ancient and alien. And they fixed directly on Jong-ho with an intensity that made him stumble backward. The pod began to crack. Lines of fracture spread across the crystalline surface like a frozen lake breaking apart in spring. And Jong-ho watched in amazement as the creature inside began to move. Its great head turned toward him, and its mouth opened to reveal teeth like curved daggers. Jong-ho knew he should run. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him to flee from this impossible predator. But something in those golden eyes made him stay. There was pain there, and fear, and beneath it all a desperate plea for help. The stasis pod shattered, and the dragon collapsed onto the frozen ground up close. Jong-ho could see that the creature was injured. Great gashes ran along its flanks, and its wings were torn in several places. Dark fluid that might have been blood seeped from wounds that looked like they had been made by weapons rather than natural causes. The dragon tried to rise but failed, its legs giving out beneath its massive body. It made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a whimper, and Jong-ho felt something brush against his mind, like a whisper in a language he did not know. He understood anyway. The creature was dying. Whatever had damaged its ship had also damaged its stasis pod, and the long journey through space had drained it of almost everything. It had perhaps days to live, maybe less, and it had crashed on a planet full of beings it did not know. Hoping against hope that someone would help, Jong-ho looked at the dragon, and the dragon looked at him. He thought about his warm house, and his quiet retirement, and the peaceful years he had planned to spend tending his wife's garden and reading books by the fire. Then he thought about Suni and how she had spent her last months in pain, and how he had done everything in his power to ease her suffering, because that was what you did for someone who needed help. He sighed and began taking off his coat. "You are going to be very difficult to hide," he said aloud. Knowing the creature probably could not understand him, the dragon's eyes tracked his movements, and something that might have been hope flickered in their golden depths. "My barn is about 2 kilometers that way," Jong-ho continued, pointing back the way he had come. "It is going to take us a very long time to get there, and my daughter is going to think I have finally lost my mind. But I did not survive 40 years of impossible engineering problems just to walk away from the most interesting one I have ever encountered." He held out his hand, not knowing if the gesture meant anything to an alien creature from the stars. The dragon studied him for a long moment. Then, very slowly, it lowered its great head until its snout touched Jong-ho's palm. The scales were surprisingly warm, and Jong-ho could feel the creature's heartbeat. Slow and weak, but still fighting. "All right then," Jong-ho said. "Let us figure out how to save your life." Far above them, hidden by the clouds, a satellite registered an unusual energy signature in the Montana wilderness within the hour. A report would land on the desk of someone who took such things very seriously within the day. Agents would be dispatched to investigate, but none of that mattered to Jong-ho as he began the long, slow process of helping an alien dragon limp through the snow toward his barn. All that mattered was that someone needed help, and he was there to give it. 3 days passed before the dragon spoke its first word. Jong-ho had converted his barn into something between a hospital and a sanctuary, using every bit of engineering knowledge he possessed to create an environment where his impossible guest might survive. He had rigged industrial heaters to maintain a constant temperature, installed ultraviolet lamps when he noticed the creatures seemed to draw strength from certain wavelengths of light, and spent hours researching what an alien being might need to eat. The answer, he discovered through trial and error, was raw meat, supplemented with certain minerals that the dragon seemed to crave. Jong-ho had driven 40 miles to the nearest town 3 times in 3 days, buying enough beef and venison to raise eyebrows at the local butcher shop. He told them he was feeding a pack of rescue dogs. The dragon lay on a bed of hay and old blankets, its golden eyes following Jong-ho's every movement as he worked. He talked to it constantly, partly because he had always talked to himself while working through problems, and partly because the silence of the barn felt too heavy without sound. He told the dragon about his wife and his children and his grandchildren. He explained how aerospace engineering worked and why he had retired and what he missed most about his old life. The dragon listened on the 3rd night. As Jong-ho was changing the bandages he had fashioned from torn bedsheets, the creature's voice entered his mind like a warm breeze through an open window. Sabiil, it said, and Jong-ho understood that this was its name. Sabiil, he repeated aloud, testing the word on his tongue. That is a Korean name, you know, one of them anyway. Learn from you. The dragon replied, and its telepathic voice carried what might have been amusement. Your thoughts are very loud. Park Jong-ho, and your language is strange but beautiful. Jong-ho sat back on his heels and stared at the creature he had spent 3 days trying to save. You can read my mind, only the surface, Sabiil assured him. The deep thoughts are your own, but when you speak inside your head as you work, I can hear, and I have been learning. Over the following days, Sabiil grew stronger, and their conversations grew longer. Jong-ho learned that she was a Dracori, a species that had once numbered in the millions, but now counted fewer than 100 survivors scattered across the galaxy. The Dracori had been created, or perhaps uplifted, by an ancient empire that had used them as living navigation systems. Something in their biology allowed them to perceive the folds in space that made faster than light travel possible for 10,000 years. The Dracori had served their masters, chained to starships and forced to guide fleets across the cosmos. When that empire fell, the Dracori should have been free. Instead, they became valuable. The Vethrak Consortium hunts us, Sabiil explained. One evening, as Jong-ho sat beside her with a cup of tea, they capture and sell Dracori to the highest bidder. And because there are so few of us left, the prices are very high. They were chasing you when you crashed here, Jong-ho said. Yes, my ship was damaged in the escape, and your world was the nearest place I could reach. Sabiil's great head turned toward the barn door, and her eyes grew distant. I thought I would die alone in the cold, but instead I found you. Lucky for both of us that I am too stubborn to mind my own business. Jong-ho replied with a small smile. Sabiil studied him with those ancient golden eyes. Why do you help me? Park Jong-ho? I am not of your kind, not of your world, and helping me puts you in danger. Jong-ho thought about the question for a long moment before answering. When my wife was sick, there were days when I did not know if she would survive until morning. But I never stopped trying to help her. Never stopped doing everything I could to give her one more good day. He paused and sipped his tea. You needed help, and I was there. And that is all the reason I have ever needed to do anything. The dragon was silent for a moment. And when she spoke again, her telepathic voice was soft with wonder. In 10,000 years of service, no one has ever cared for me simply because I needed caring for, and I do not know how to repay such kindness. Stay alive, Jong-ho said simply. That is payment enough. The next morning, 2 black SUVs appeared at the end of Jong-ho's driveway. He watched them through the kitchen window as 4 men in dark suits stepped out and began walking toward his house. Government agents, he guessed, probably from one of the agencies he had. worked with during his career. They would have detected the crash and traced it here. And they would want to know what he had found. Jong-ho met them on his porch with a cup of coffee in his hand and a pleasant expression on his face. "Good morning, gentlemen. Can I help you?" The lead agent flashed a badge that Jong-ho did not bother to read. "Mr. Park, we have detected some unusual activity in this area and would like to ask you a few questions." "Of course," Jong-ho replied easily, "but I am afraid I have not noticed anything unusual. Just the usual deer and the occasional bear getting into my garbage." The agent searched his property for 3 hours. They found nothing in the barn because Sabiil, drawing on the last of her recovering strength, had made herself invisible. It was a Dracori ability that Jong-ho had not known about, and watching the agents walk past a dragon they could not see was one of the strangest experiences of his life after they left. Sabiil materialized with a sound like wind chimes, and Jong-ho let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "That was too close," he said. "It will get closer," Sabiil replied, and there was sorrow in her voice. "The consortium will come, Jong-ho. They always do, and they will not be as polite as your government men. How long do we have? Days perhaps, maybe weeks if we are fortunate." Jong-ho nodded slowly, his mind already working through the problem like it was an engineering challenge rather than a death sentence. "Then we had better use that time wisely." He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through contacts he had not used in years. Old colleagues and friends from his military days, people who owed him favors, and people who might just be crazy enough to help. "What are you doing?" Sabiil asked, calling in some reinforcements. Jong-ho replied, "You are not the only one with abilities, Sabiil, and if the consortium thinks they can come to my home and threaten someone under my protection, they are about to learn why humans have survived as long as we have." The dragon watched him with something new in her golden eyes. "Something that might have been hope. You would fight for me. I have been fighting for things that matter my entire life." Jong-ho said, "I am too old to stop now.